And we're back, and we're going to talk about some criticisms of the U.S. Constitution and why they're wrong, according to this man, Rob Natelson. Thanks for coming on the show, Rob.
It's a kick to be back with you, Mike.
All right. I play a constitutional scholar at home.
Do you really?
I do. And it doesn't work out particularly well. But you're an actual constitutional scholar in your career, which is a little bit different. And so we want to bring you on the show and talk about you recently wrote a significant article about criticisms of the Constitution, and many of them are back in the news even recently. They tend to ebb and flow depending on who the president is and what the Supreme Court's doing and who runs Congress. Depends on which side of the political aisle has a criticism of the Constitution that year. And so we want to talk about some of these. I remember taking undergraduate courses about the Constitution, and we looked at some of the big Supreme Court cases of the modern era, and that was roughly the extent of it. So we didn't really look at the document itself or the origins of the document or how it came to be. But you're a guy who has actually taken a very close look at that stuff. In fact, you've written a book about it. We're going to put this up here, The Original Constitution. And you write about what they meant and said at the time the Constitution was enacted, right?
Yes. Mike, your experience with just reading a few Supreme Court cases is pretty common.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
In constitutional law courses, they tend to start with 1803 with the famous John Marshall case of Marbury versus Madison. They don't look at any of the roots before that. In fact, there's a saying among constitutional law professors that I don't have my students read the Constitution, it just confuses them.
You guys are a crazy bunch over there at constitutional law. All right, but let's talk about, these criticisms are meaningful though, because if enough people listen to them, they really start to question our Constitution, which I think has served us pretty darn well over the years. So let's talk about a few from what you wrote. And the first is, and here's what you hear sometimes, is that the original Constitutional Convention was a runaway convention.
Yeah.
These guys, they were only supposed to come up with some amendments to the Articles of Confederation. They weren't supposed to, and they went crazy and wrote an entirely new document. True or false?
False.
No?
Really, really common though. It's a kind of a slander on the founders that began in the ratification era among the anti-federalists who opposed the Constitution. They said that the delegates had exceeded their authority. And many people believe it today because they know that there was a resolution in the Confederation Congress in February of 1787, which expressed in very weak terms that maybe the convention ought to be limited to amending the Articles of Confederation. But in fact, 8 states had already empowered the convention to go further. The convention was not called by Congress, it was called by the Commonwealth of Virginia. And its purpose was to render the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. That was the phrase. So in other words, whatever was necessary, they should propose. And so there were relatively few delegates to the Constitutional Convention who were constrained to just propose amendments to the Constitution. Most of them didn't sign the Constitution or went home. The vast majority of delegates had exactly the power to do what they did.
Yeah, it sounds like they weren't so much runaways, that they were given a fairly broad authority to do what was necessary to be done, and they did it.
That's right. They were given almost a blank slate.
All right. The other criticism that you hear oftentimes, and this certainly comes up in the debate with regard to the Bill of Rights and guns today, is that the Constitution was written in horse and buggy days, and the days of when people fought with muskets, and commerce was different, and there were no interstate highways, there were no cars, all those things, and so the Constitution is an old-fashioned document that dealt with old-fashioned times that we need to reinterpret it for modern times. What do you say to that?
Well, it's occasionally true, and we have an amendment process for that reason. But the framers who wrote the Constitution knew they were writing for the ages. In fact, John Dickinson at the convention said explicitly that we should produce a document that's not sufficient, that is not just going to last for a year or an age, but forever. And so they drafted the Constitution to take into account things like technological changes, political changes. Remember that when they met in 1787, the island of Great Britain was already going through the Industrial Revolution. There were already major changes that were beginning to happen. There was air flight, for example, by balloon. There were the beginnings of self-propelled vehicles, automobiles. People knew that huge changes were happening. And so they wrote the Constitution very deftly. Some parts of the Constitution are very flexible and designed to expand and contract as needed. Others are quite rigid, and then others are somewhere in between. Usually the people who complain about the rigidity of the Constitution are people who really don't want a written Constitution at all. They would rather have something like the system in Britain where Parliament can ultimately do whatever it wants.
The subtitle of your book is what it actually said and meant.
Yeah.
And one of the other criticisms you often hear about the Constitution, and this, in some ways, this makes sense, especially with to someone like me who has had who only took a few these courses that don't really actually explain the document to you. You took the minimum amount necessary to get out of school or whatever you did. Is that the Constitution's full of these kind of terms and words and sayings and phrases that seem kind of vague or don't really make a lot of sense. And so this thing really needs to be interpreted. But here's the funny thing, that stuff all meant something at the time this was written.
It did. And yet even Supreme Court justices have made that mistake. I mean, Justice William Brennan, who was a stalwart on the liberal side of the Warren Court. Of course, the Warren Court was at all on liberal side. But he once referred to the Constitution's ennobling phrases as luminous and obscure. What he and many people didn't realize is just what you said. Many of these clauses had fairly or very clear meanings. And the way you divine those meanings is you study 18th century law. So, for example, take the necessary and proper clause, a clause which says that Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution its other powers. People looked at that and said, well, what's this necessary and proper thing mean? Where does that come from? The answer is it's an extremely common phrase in 18th century documents. It was construed by 18th century courts. So we have a very good idea of what it means. It gives the Constitution a certain amount of flexibility, but not infinite flexibility in the lawmaking power. Privileges or immunities is another good example. Very, very common phrase in the 18th century with rather specific meanings. Habeas corpus is a more famous example. And so the people who claim that the Constitution's phrases are vague or they don't mean anything are by and large people who haven't really gotten into the language of the time. The other thing to remember, Mike, is that not only is there legal language in the Constitution, but there are ordinary words in the Constitution that have changed meaning.
Right.
So, for example, in the preamble refers to a more perfect union. And some folks have said, well, what's this more perfect thing? I mean, perfect is without flaw. You can't have something that's more perfect. What do they mean? And the answer is, in the 18th century, the term perfect was closer to its Latin roots, which means complete, a more complete union. That under the Articles of Confederation, we had a very loose union. And so one of the purposes behind the Constitution is to make the union more complete. Not totally complete, still a federal system, but more complete. And so knowing something about 18th century vocabulary, knowing something about 18th century law is really critical. People tend to make two opposite mistakes. One mistake is, oh gee, the Constitution's inscrutable, nobody can figure it out. And the mistake on the other side is, all I have to do is just sit down and read it and I'll understand it. And the truth is in between those.
Right. It sometimes seems like people get to what they do is of course, law professors like the idea that it's inscrutable, so only they can explain it, I'm sure. But,
or more precisely, in the case of many law professors, so they can take their preferred content and pour it into those clauses and change the document.
And this is what I was going to say next, is that this way people can pick their own expert.
Yeah.
And then their expert can explain to them what the Constitution meant. But the funny thing is that these words, these phrases, these sentences, they had actual meaning.
Yeah.
And all we have to do is go back and see what that actual meaning was, and then we can say today, they still mean that, whatever that definition was.
Now, I don't want to claim that we can do that with every single clause with 100% accuracy. There are some clauses that maybe weren't entirely clear, even to the founders, although for example, the term Republican form of government.
Right.
I can give you the 3 factors that the vast majority of founders would have said are key to a republic, but there might have been a few founders that disagreed. So I don't want to oversell that. Nevertheless, we can reconstruct the original meaning of the Constitution a whole lot better than critics of originalism or of the Constitution claim that we can.
Okay. This one, I think something we're going to see some more of here in Colorado moving forward, because there's going to be a measure on the 2020 ballot to repeal the national popular vote compact law that was passed by the legislature and signed by Governor Polis. So this is going to be a fairly big fight in 2020 between people who like the Electoral College, which is the system that is defined in the Constitution, and people who want a national popular vote to decide the president. One of the things that I've been hearing that has been bubbling up is that the Electoral College is a remnant of slavery. And in fact, that this was put into the Constitution for the benefit of slavery, and it's time to be cast out, just like we cast that out of the Constitution and did away with it many, many years ago. Is this, what's the validity of this?
It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. And there are several indications of that. One is that the 3 states most committed to slavery at the Constitutional Convention, that is to say, Georgia and the Carolinas, all voted against the Electoral College. They wanted a different method of choosing the president. During the discussion on the Electoral College, slavery maybe came up once at a time. James Madison raised it at a time after a vote had already occurred. It didn't really have any influence on the deliberations of the convention. The deliberations of the convention centered around other issues entirely, such questions as how do we make sure that the president is somebody who can do the job? How do we set up a system that ensures that he has a great deal of popular support? How can we ensure that popular support is nationwide rather than just in a few regions? How can we ensure that the president remains independent of Congress and can exercise independent of judgment? How do we assure that he remains independent of the states? And on and on. It was one of the most difficult proceedings they had to go through. James Wilson, one of the convention delegates, said it was the most difficult issue of all. And it was not slavery at all. James Wilson, for example, was a fierce opponent of slavery, yet he also strongly supported the Electoral College and the presidential election system in the Pennsylvania ratifying convention. He did not favor direct popular vote, as some people have claimed. And so the position that people retreat to when they're confronted with these facts is they say, well, the electors are assigned according to the number of members of Congress that each state sends, and that was affected by slavery. Yeah, it was affected by slavery, but it had only very incidental influence on the Electoral College.
Wow. Interesting. All right. Thanks, Rob. Thanks. The book, of course, available on Amazon.com, I assume.
Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
At Barnes & Noble. That's fantastic. All right. Well, thanks very much for joining us again. We're out of time. And check us out at CompleteColorado.com, and we will see you next week. Thanks. No, thank you, Rob.